Welcome to part 2 of the Art and Culture of Japan before the year 1333. When we left off with part 1, we were talking about the Nara period, when the capital finally settled to one location, well, at least for a little while, for a couple hundred years. During this time, the emperors became quite devout Buddhists, and they developed Nara Park in the city, which was the home to both a Shinto temple and a Buddhist shrine. And here we're seeing the Buddhist temple. It's called the Great Buddha Hall at Todaiji. This particular structure has an interesting history. It's actually it's not as large as it was when it was originally built. When it was originally built, it was 90 feet tall, yet it is still the largest wooden structure in the world. Now, as it goes with many rising and falling dynasties, this was destroyed and had to have been rebuilt 4 times throughout its history. It underwent a massive renovation in the early 1900s, which allowed it to survive to this day. They added some steel supports and some hidden cement masonry to make it all stand well. But as it is, it's an ongoing Buddhist temple that was first built in the year 752. Now, we have these devout emperors. They were so devout that the daughter of the Emperor Shomu, who wanted to leave his post and become a Buddhist monk, she became the empress. But then she wanted to install a Buddhist monk as emperor. And well, this was just too much for the court. So once again, they moved the capital to Kyoto, which is where it remained for several hundred years. When the capital was moved from Nara to Kyoto, we have the beginning of the Han period, which lasted for about 400 years. During this time, Japan cultivated its own traditions, adapted from Chinese influence, but much less dependent on that influence. The Japanese written language was further developed in a more stylized and aesthetically pleasing form, and a tradition of literature was established. The move from Nara also marked a change in Buddhist practices, as the traditions that were followed in the previous capital gave way to what's called esoteric Buddhism, or Tantric Buddhism as it's referred to in Nepal. Now, this form of Buddhism was really dependent upon the multiple deities, very influenced by the Hindu tradition, actually. So instead of the Lord Buddha having being the main course of focus, there was instead a Buddha that was a universal Buddha called Dainichi, and it was the kind of leader of all of these sub-Buddhas, which we see here in the Womb World Mandala. Each of these Buddhas, and this was a very complex cosmology. It took a lot to learn and to understand it, and this mandala was originally created in order to help people with that understanding. But we have the great Dainichi in the center, surrounded by the hierarchy, and then Buddhas to each of the directions. One thing that you would note if you looked at this closely was that below, down here, are demons. And it's very interesting that the demons in Buddhist art are remarkably similar to those that show up in other religious expressions. Maybe that's a universal aspect of the human condition, that we materialize these lesser angels of our nature, so to speak. So anyway, this is one example of a mandala. Often mandalas are circular, but this one is done in the square format. Beginning in the 11th century, there was a lot of turbulence in Japan, political unrest, difficulties in general. And as we've seen throughout history, this led people to seek a spiritual solution. So the sect of Buddhism known as Pure Land Buddhism rose to prominence during this time. And in this belief system, there is a Western paradise that is filled with divine flowers and music. It's a place where the heart and body and mind can finally be in complete ease. And it comes after death. The Pure Land beliefs offered a very simpler path to salvation than what we saw in the esoteric school of Buddhism with all the levels of deities. All you have to do in Pure Land Buddhism to get to heaven is to just keep chanting Namo Amida Butsu. That's it. All you have to do is that, and then when you die, you get to go to the Western Paradise. So what we're looking at here is one of the finest examples of a Pure Land temple. And this is in Byodoin, in Ujai, which is outside of Kyoto, up in the mountains. Now, this was originally built as a residence hall for a powerful person in the court. But when he died, his ancestors decided to turn it into a temple. Now, this particular temple has got a lot of features that reflect the Pure Land belief system. The water is a man-made pond that's actually created in the shape of the letter A in Sanskrit. This is to honor Amida. Now, in each of these dwellings, they have the high, narrow posts, which really lend a feeling of airiness and openness and a communion with nature. Now, when we consider that this was actually built in 1053 and is still in use to this day, it's really highly successful, just simply as an architectural structure. Now, here's a Buddha that's found. This is a depiction of Amida Buddha, that's found in this residence hall. It's actually exterior so that it's reflected in the pond. But what we see here is the Amida Buddha, and then around the side are all these little Buddhas and angels that are playing musical instruments in support. An interesting thing to note about this particular sculpture is that it was not carved from one block of wood, but rather was carved by laminating several blocks of wood together. And this shift in technique allowed for the Japanese and other sculptors to make ever larger wooden sculptures in honor of the Buddha. In a parallel to the development of the Buddhist practices, there was a very strong cultivation of secular arts. The centuries-long influence of the Chinese has faded away during this time, and a uniquely Japanese aesthetic arose. In the court of the Han, the development of all forms of art was highly regarded, and the woman would dress in such a way so that the 12 layers of her robe had a certain relationship that was very tasteful. And a man might show his level of development by guessing what kind of incense was being burned. One of the interesting outcomes of this time was a real fascination with romantic love, which gave birth to the first novel ever written in history. We believe that The Tale of the Genji is believed to be one of the earliest novels ever created. And what it does is it accounts the escapades of the great Prince Genji and his cohorts as they have several different romantic affairs, and ultimately it's a kind of a morality tale because it emphasizes the transitory nature of the earthly passions in favor of Buddhist belief systems. Now, this is an illustration of, oh, by the way, this was written by a woman, by a lady of the court who was named Lady Murasaki, and she wrote it about the prince in order to entertain her other ladies of the court. This book was illustrated about 100 years after it was written, and this rather interesting illustration kind of opens up from the top of the roof and looks into the palace room as events from the book are unfolding. Of course, this was not a book as we consider it, but it was rather a hand scroll that was unrolled as the adventures unfolded. During this period, we also have a development of Japanese calligraphy, which originated from the Chinese script, but then became its own unique form of writing. Here we have a book from the Ishimaya Gire, or it's called the 36 Immortal Poets, who wrote 39 volumes of poetry. Now, these volumes were scattered, some of them still remain, but when one of the volumes was taken apart and the single pages were sold, then it became the Ishimayagire. Well, what we see here is a style that's uniquely Japanese in the free-flowing nature of the letters, in the way that the pages are decorated, and occasionally there's more complex Chinese style script included. What poem is depicted here is the following. Until yesterday, I could meet her, but today she is gone. Like clouds over the mountain, she has been wafted away. So this reflects the sort of romantic nature of imperial art of the time. And as you look at this book, there's aspects of torn paper, there's flecks of gold scattered across the pages. It has a sort of an accidental look, which reflects the Japanese aesthetic and is really anything but accidental. One important thing to remember is that they read like this: down, top to bottom, and right to left. So very different than the Western way of reading. So now we'll look at one more work from this period, and it's one that I actually really love. I'm not sure how well it will show up in the slide, but it's wonderful. It's humorous. It's frolicking animals. So here we have a frog dressed as a Buddhist priest in front of kind of a frog Buddha. And you can see that from his mouth, if you look closely, he's pontificating. He's spouting all these noble truths, while other animals sit around and listen to him. There seems to be a mouse or a fox at a table over here, and others in robes that are listening. The more you look at this, the more you see, and it's clear that the artist had a great sense of humor and probably had a great time in depicting those that were pious in words and maybe not so much in their actions. So now let's move on to the samurai period. So the people of the Han court became so increasingly engrossed in their own spiritual and aesthetic development that they neglected governing the country. At the same time, there were groups of warrior clans, known as samurai, that were developing outside of the capital. They would fight amongst themselves, and the leaders would gain control of territory. And ultimately, the emperor in Kyoto was forced to have an alliance with the leader of the Minamoto clan named Yoritomo. He insisted that he be declared the shogun, or the military leader. And while the emperor still held power, the shogun actually had ultimate power. And this gave birth to what's called the Kamakura period. The notion of the shogunate, or the shoguns actually having a lot of power within Japan, it lasted until the 1880s when it finally gave way. But this was a powerful way to have military rule in the court as the court developed aesthetically. So the technique of fighting of the early samurai warriors was to gallop towards the enemy on horseback, and then just as they turned the horse away, to shoot an arrow. This armor is what was used for that kind of battle. Now, as they became more proficient in the development of steel, then they were able to develop these very sharp swords. Now, there's a common problem when you think about developing a razor edge on a sword, because if it's a metal that will take that much of an edge, it will probably break easily. So they managed to laminate stronger and more flexible layers of steel in order to make their swords. This armor that we're looking at here consists of leather and iron that are laced together in alternative layers in order to protect the wearer, who is probably, in this case, riding on horseback and shooting arrows. Here we have a little bit of samurai art where the leader of the Minamoto clan has a nighttime raid on the Sanjo Palace. In this case, they burn down the wooden palace, and a lot of them are shooting bows and arrows. There was the Taira clan and the Minamoto clan, and ultimately the Minamoto prevailed. However, not without lots of bloodshed and dramatic events as we see depicted here. What about Buddhist art of this period? Let's look at a little bit of Pure Land Buddhist sculpture. Oh look, this is one of my favorite pieces of all time. As samurai battles waged, we also had a radical increase in the practice of Pure Land Buddhism, which is something that we see often. As life gets more difficult, more people are focused on the afterlife. And this particular fella is named Kosho Kuya. Kuya was a very famous monk, a practitioner of this style of Buddhism. And what he did was he would encourage people to chant the name of Buddha over and over and over in a mantric fashion. And the reason that I'm so fond of this particular one is that the sculptor managed to do this very literally. There are 6 little Amida Buddhas coming out of the mouth of the monk, and they are said to symbolize each of the syllables of the sacred chant that he was encouraging his followers to take up. There's more symbols here of this particular monk. It's really a portrait of him. The deer horn that's on his staff symbolizes the fact that he shot a deer, which caused him to convert and become a Buddhist. There's other implements that indicate that it is in fact the famous Buddhist monk Kuya, who's preaching or encouraging his followers to recite the mantra. During this period, we also have the emergence of what's called a Ryago painting, Ryago. And in this painting, it shows the Amida Buddha returning to earth. In the Pure Land Buddhism, they believed that just even one, completely sincere invocation of the phrase Namu Amida Butsu could allow the most hardened, wicked sinner to go to paradise. So you can see its attraction for the common folks. These kind of paintings were very different than the ones that we see from esoteric Buddhism, like the mandala that we saw a few slides back. In this case, it's really the Amida Buddha and all the Bodhisattva kind of angel helpers surrounding it coming to earth. And generally, these would be used in a dying person's home, and there was often actually a gold cord attached. So the person dying could hang on physically to the gold cord, and hopefully at that moment of death they would go to the Western paradise and all would be well. This particular painting is really a masterful work in the application of gold leaf and several other aspects, including the depiction of the landscape in a very detailed and sensitive form. So now let's talk for a moment about the practice of Zen Buddhism, and that will finish out the audio lecture. Unlike Pure Land Buddhism, which promised salvation in the afterlife, the practice of Zen is more about being fully present in this life. Zen practitioners have a strong focus on meditation practice, on stillness, on emptying of the mind. This particular painting is of Daruma, the founder of Zen. In the year 600, he immigrated from India to China and brought the teaching of Zen Buddhism, or called Chan, in China. So lastly, let's look at the person who brought Zen from China to Japan. And this is the Zen master Langzi Diaolong. This painting is created in a style unique to Zen called Chinso. And what he did was he came to Japan and was given honors by the Minamoto shogun. And he was encouraged to start a temple at Kenchoji, which is still a very active temple to this day. This particular painting was given to a member of the shogunate, so probably used as sort of a political gift also. So this last picture concludes our audio lecture on the art and culture of Japan before the year 1333. Thank you so much for listening.